the Director of International Product and Fraud Management at Inteliquent, and also the CFCA President. So first and foremost, I want to thank everyone for taking time out of your schedules today to not only listen to myself, but for all of your support through our summer of education, and hopefully you guys have gotten a lot out of that. So just to kick us off, a little bit of housekeeping, Inteliquent time, just to cover a little bit of who we are and what we do. There's a whole lot of words on this screen. I'm not going to go into a whole lot of details with them. After this presentation, you will receive the recording of this session, which has this if you have interest in going back and learning more about what Inteliquent is. Our big thing and our company motto is that we have the best people delivering the best service on the best network. And we have a great group of dedicated employees who really push to live up to that. Just another screen, more about the products we offer and our focus on quality and what we believe sets us apart from others in the industry. Who is Inteliquent? Just like many of you on this phone call, we've gone through a lot of acquisition activity over the last several years. So these may be all names of companies you've heard of over the years, and they are now all part of one thing. In the past, you've heard me even talk about the fact that we had two separate sides of our business, which was Voyant and Inteliquent. And this year we are working on bringing all of that in under the Inteliquent name as well. So if you see any of these names and you ever need any help with anything, feel free to reach out to me and I can hook you up with, connect you to somebody who can help you. All right, so now time to take a look at what you actually joined today to listen to me talk about, which is short duration traffic. Not sure if you hear about this much. It's maybe not typically defined as a fraud that you work on from time to time, but it can be very harmful and it can definitely have an impact and be fraudulent in nature. So what is short duration traffic? What makes it up? Well, you have emergency alerts, right? These are going to be your school closings or maybe even Amber alerts. A lot of times they are just short bursts of traffic that send very small things across your network. Collections calls, these are going to be, legitimate calls that people don't necessarily answer. So it's collections. A lot of times people call them robocalls. Robocalls is another one. Your machine dialing calls. These are going to be the bad illegal types of calls. Legal solicitation, again, kind of goes in with robocalls, but these ones are legal. This is going to be political campaign type calls and stuff that people have actually subscribed to. Load balance testing, this is one that I hear a lot when we're working on our toll-free traffic pumping. You see a lot of short duration burst calls to toll-free numbers over and over, and they're testing to make sure everything's up and working. Call center traffic, obviously, those generate a lot of short duration calls, and a lot of times people tie that back to robocalling. The new trend that's really picking up with ringless voicemail, your call doesn't even ring, it just goes straight to leaving a voicemail, which could add up, or maybe they don't leave a voicemail, that can add up. And of course your spam and scams, as people more and more aren't answering their phones, it's good they're missing out on the scams, but it's also a short duration call that's not generating much usage. So all in all, that I would say that you have two types of short duration calls. You have your good short duration calls and you have your bad short duration calls. And kind of my goal in my topic today is identifying how to find the median between those. So one thing that I did, just because it's a hot topic in my company, I'm not sure about yours, but I went to several people and got some quotes from them on what their thoughts are about short duration traffic. And you really do have a split on your sales and product side of the business that believe that short duration calls are good. And then you have your operations and sometimes your product side that believe your short duration calls are not so good. So I wanted to share some of the quotes with you today because they were kind of interesting. There are good short duration calls such as notifications from Walgreens, airline flight updates, school closing, pack messages during election years. I agree with this, that these are all very legitimate good calls that are going to be short duration and going through our networks. This year especially, you know, we have census type calls, which is, to me, part of that is legitimate. This is another one that makes a lot of sense to me. What is the new normal? Given the prevalent use of mobile devices and voicemails that answer instead of people, or messages not being left at all, short duration calls are now part of a new normal calling pattern. You know, that is true. You do see a drop off in duration just because, I mean, I personally don't leave voicemails anymore. If they don't answer, I hang up and I send a text message. Companies that have OTT applications and a generational change where messages aren't left when calls go unanswered result in shorter duration calling patterns. Legitimate P2P voice and messaging traffic is a segment that will continue to grow and needs to be served by a good partner that will and can weed out bad behavior when it occurs. The world has changed and is continuing to change. I think that quote has a whole lot of meaning right now, maybe not even just tied to short duration, but it's all very true. And of course, many of these customers are following regulations and guidelines, and it is good and legal traffic regardless of consumer perception. And those are large customers that generate ample revenues and margins for the company. You know, I don't disagree with any of these as far as, you know, what people are saying. So now, what about the bad? What are people's perceptions that think that this traffic is bad? Most of the short duration calls are fraudulent in nature. Again, this comes down to perception. They're not wrong. They're calls that people don't want. I have FCC seems powerless in nailing these offenders. I think that's been true in the past with the Trace Act and the action that the FCC, FTC, and everybody has taken so far this year. I think they are starting to gain a whole lot more power in fines and in getting the bad players shut down. It was a big mistake for our marketing and sales teams actively going after short duration business. It tarnishes our reputation as a good operator, keeping both eyes closed and knowingly becoming a willful facilitator of fraudulent traffic all consumers hate. I like this quote. It's a harsh quote. Again, it comes down to perception. So in the consumer's eyes, and you know, a lot of the phone calls I take, they're receiving calls from a number. They look that number up. They see that that call is owned, that number is owned by Envoy, Inteliquent, and they reach out to us about, you have to stop these. When we do the testing, you know, it was a legitimate call from a collections agency trying to get them to pay a bill. But there's become such a perception about any call that a consumer doesn't want is a bad call, that it can kind of tarnish that reputation. I've never really differentiated between good versus bad and just looked at conversational versus non-conversational and considered the latter a hindrance to our network. That is actually a very true statement, and I'll go into that a little bit more later about why that's a hindrance to the network. Again, another very true statement here. Our CPS guidelines of 16 CPS per 1,000 sessions when provisioning trunks is generous and doubling what we know most of our cable and wireless customers use on their own networks. Even with doubling that, we are constantly getting asked for more. And one more, we are actually losing money due to CapEx and OpEx. So that's a great statement. In the previous slide, we had a quote that says, hey, these are large revenue generating customers, everything's good. On the flip side of that, they're saying we're actually losing money. So as an example of that, if you have one SBC and it's licensed for 99,000 calls, of which you have to pay for each individual session license, and the SBC will max out at 45,000 sessions because of the CPS limitations, you're essentially wasting 50,000 licenses. And so that's where, you know, the cost impact from the CapEx and the OpEx side can actually really eat into your revenue and margins. And my personal favorite If anything I've heard anybody in my company say is, shouldn't we be able to work with most customers to remove the bad and keep the good rather than writing them off entirely as a customer? And that's kind of the point of my entire presentation today. Is there's absolutely bad customers out there, and there's bad guys out there, and they, you shut them down once and they come in as another name. But overall, the vast majority of companies want to do the right thing, and they will work with you to try to find the problem and make it better. Now, some don't, or they say they are, and it never gets better. But you have a lot of them out there that really do want to participate and help solve the problem. All right, so time for some examples. Now, these are kind of made up numbers. They're in the ballpark of a couple of customer examples, but just to kind of tell you, in my own personal opinion, how I look at some of our customers. So on one Mississippi, on one Mississippi, you can see that this customer, the good side of the story is we make $550,000 a month revenue off of them. The bad side of the story is in CapEx cost to handle their short duration traffic. It costs us $120,000 in CapEx to support their short duration calling. The truth is we're still making $430,000 off of that customer. The problem, the customer is consistently a top contributor to our third-party consumer complaints coming in, but they will work with us to address issues if we say, hey, you've got to fix some of these short duration issues, or if we send them or escalate to them any of the consumer complaints that we're getting, they'll feed us back information on who it was coming from. We're able to work with them to even help them trend on their side. This particular one that I have in mind had some issues with toll-free traffic pumping. They started feeding me information about where it was coming in from on their side, and we were able to find a company in Miami that was a root cause of a whole lot of their toll-free traffic pumping complaints we were receiving. So I would say this customer's in the middle. It's not a customer that very many people love, but they're at least willing to try and work with us a little bit. So this is one that's kind of in the middle, and you kind of continue to work with them to figure out how to weed out the bad and keep the good. To Mississippi, again, kind of a middle-ish kind of customer. We don't really hear much about them when it comes to third-party complaints or, reports from our vendors about anything they're seeing on their network. And they always share details with us about new opportunities that they have coming their way, so that, we can say, no, we don't want that traffic, or to keep that from coming towards us. But at the same time, we're spending more to terminate their calls than we're actually generating revenue on their short duration traffic. So, that becomes a problem. A couple that I would consider bad examples, on 3 Mississippi, this one, the good is we make $10,000 a month in revenue. The bad is the CapEx and OpEx is about $20,000. So we're losing $10,000 a month on their short duration traffic. They're always in the top 3 of third-party consumer complaints and scam reports. And we don't get a whole lot of feedback from them when we do send them any kind of a notification that they're doing anything to make it better. So this is a type of customer that would fall into a bad category, and that we'd start to work with our legal teams to send warning letters and push it at a whole other level to try to figure out how we either work with them, or if they're a customer that we need to get rid of altogether. For Mississippi, kind of the exact same scenario, only much worse. We make $40,000 a month revenue out of them, but we spend $100,000 a month, so we're losing $60,000 a month. They have lots of third-party complaints against them, and they give feedback and they say that they're working to make changes. We just never see it get better. So again, this is one that you start to want to get a little bit more involved in and try to figure out how you can get rid of some of this traffic. A good example is my 5 Mississippi at the bottom. We make $150,000 a month on them. CapEx for their short duration traffic is about $40,000, so we're still very profitable. We rarely hear any complaints about their traffic when it comes to consumer reports. And if we ever do receive anything and I send it to them, not only do they respond immediately that they're going to take care of it, many times they've completely shut down a customer, and you know, they're really in it to try to make sure that whatever the short duration stuff is that's going through their network is completely taken care of and that they're on the up and up. So these aren't specific examples, you know, numbers are rounded. My numbers don't necessarily also include OpEx expenses of, you know, the time our client services team spends with them, or you know, working repair tickets, database or dipping fees, especially in toll-free traffic pumping, etc. This is very specific just to the short duration traffic and the CDRs associated with it. All right, so time for action. So as a customer, as a company, what can we do to help control this? You know, I talk a lot about finding the good and weeding out the bad, and it's an ongoing battle and always looking for better ways to do that. But some of the things that we do, I'm not going to go through a whole lot of details in this. Obviously, you know, you have different things that trigger a number for investigation. You have your ACD, you have your ASR, just the pure volume of calls. One number making multiple calls, or one number receiving multiple calls, especially if they're all of the same duration. And carrier and consumer reports. We definitely look at everything any of our carrier partners send us, as well as things that come in through our legal team and our consumer reports. We even have some consumers that I've worked with directly and they send me emails directly, and we absolutely take a look at everything that comes our way. We have several options. We have, you know, no treatment, right, wrong, or indifferent, and perception of the consumer. Some of those calls are just legal, collections calls, political calls, just because they don't want to receive the call, and they are obnoxious, because I get some of them as well. They are legal, and they're able to make them. Whitelist, obviously, if you're getting complaints on something but you've already tested, you've done your research, you know, we can whitelist that number from and keep it from triggering an alert on our own network in the future, and already, you know, have the data on that research. So if we get the complaint from somebody else, randomizer and whisper are very similar, and that's just the names that we use for them on our side. It's not necessarily the same as, you know, what others would call a whisper. They're very similar, but basically if it triggers a threshold and it puts it into our randomizer or whisper, it requires the caller to enter a 2-digit number, a random number, and if they don't, the call will fail. And the thought behind that being, if it is a machine dialed call, it won't hear that announcement and be able to enter those digits. And then of course proactive blocking. Per, you know, your FCC orders, there's stuff that you can block that are do not originate and are invalid, unallocated, or unused numbers. So we definitely utilize that as well. These charts are a little hard to read, but just to kind of show you volumes of things that we are capturing. Our randomizer, the green lines are the number of calls that are kind of falling into potential randomizer treatment. What I always think is good is the second 2 bars when they're the same, because that's a good sign that what we are applying the randomizer to actually failed because of the randomizer, and that means we're not capturing a bunch that we're applying the randomizer to that shouldn't have been, because it was an actual human calling. So lots of bars and lines on that one, and if anybody has more questions, you know, we can talk about that offline. Same on the whisper. We actually don't offer the whisper to every customer like we do on the randomizer. This one's a little more specific to just a handful of customers, but same thing, same data. These are calls that we're capturing, and that we, you know, are requiring them to enter those 2 digits or calls will fail. And when I think is one of our largest success stories is something that here internally we call anti-management. The purpose of anti-management is to identify and block originating telephone numbers that are abusive based on repeated attempts through the network. So how do we determine what those are. There's thresholds built into that are hourly attempt thresholds, margin thresholds, and ALOC thresholds. If it triggers any of those thresholds within the platform, it's identified, it's put on the list for 30 days. We have different lists. We have a black list, that's the main list, and that's where all of them go. If it triggers that it breached the threshold, it's going to go on to the blacklist. If a customer calls in and complains and the NOC takes a look at it, or the fraud team takes a look at it, or product or network cost team, or whoever it may be, and they determine that it truly is legitimate, they can whitelist it. Two things that we can do there: we just take it off the blacklist, meaning it will, possibly trigger again in the future, or we can put it on an actual white list that would, it would remain there indefinitely. We try not to do that too often because how fast numbers can change hands. We don't want it to miss something in the future. Regardless, if it's not white, if we don't specifically whitelist it, after 30 days, the number automatically comes off the list, and then it monitors for it again, and it can go right back on. So we see numbers that maybe go on once, come off after 30 days, and you never see it again, versus numbers that it goes on the list, it comes off, and within an hour, it's right back on the list for another 30 days. But it has really helped, to capture a whole lot of that on our network. Kind of a side note, you can't do this if you're the sole provider for the customer, because you have to be able to terminate their calls. So we do only implement this for customers that we're able to route advance on their traffic. So as I said before, this is one of the ones that I think is one of our biggest success stories when it comes to our short duration traffic. And it was actually, I can't take credit for it. It was put together by Tim Schneeberger, who is in our cost management team and works a lot with product and carrier relations. But, he gave me these examples of, if you look at it before implementation, vendor contracts with a short duration clause for surcharges on traffic, usually in excess of 20% duration. And that's pretty average. Most of your carrier contracts are going to have that 20% short duration penalty mark. And if you breach that, there's usually a surcharge per call. So if we look at our top 3 vendors of whom we received surcharges from prior to implementing anti-management, that was averaging us approximately $285,000 per month just in surcharges because of our excess volume of short duration traffic. And after implementation, if you look at all carriers combined, not even just those 3, we have not had any short duration surcharge penalties since this was implemented on our network. So that was a huge win as far as identifying some of the bad, figuring out how to weed it out, and still keeping the good. So what else do you do to take action? Communication to me is huge. Providing notifications to your customers and with lots of details. Not all of our customers have the same training that we do, right? This is what we do. We work in telecom, we work in fraud, we work in revenue assurance. We know the details. Not all of our customers, know all of those details or even all of the regulations and everything involved. So customer education and guidance and training, and even maybe helping them with some of their consumer education. Of course, Inteliquent's a little bit different. We don't, provide the service to the direct end user, so we can help our customers with some of that consumer education. Many of you on this call have the direct consumer, so really educating the consumer as well. They're not going to want to know about a whole lot of regulation and etc., but best practices and what it means and what's happening and why what they're doing may be bad. An example of this one is I have a customer that we get a lot of third-party complaints from. We even had to, get legal involved, send them a letter. We worked with their legal. Of course, the customer themselves, they just kept pushing back on our teams that were trying to work with them about the problems that they were having. And when we sent the legal notice and got their legal involved, we got on the phone with their lawyer, and her response was, "Oh yeah, we know they have a problem. We're working with them on it." So even though they were pushing back, they just didn't understand it. And so when you got a little higher up, you know, they did. So I did some training with that customer about why some of the things they were doing were wrong. They were pushing back a lot and not taking any action on IRS scam notifications because they didn't see the calls. They weren't making those calls. And, you know, I was able to explain to them that their DID was being spoofed and used to make those calls. And that made a whole lot more sense to them. And I haven't seen them push back very hard on those kind of notices going out for a while now. I was also talking to them about some of their toll-free, what I thought was toll-free traffic bumping. They would have just a high volume of short duration calls to toll-free numbers. And they said, well, that's just the nature of their business because they have multiple customers and their customers will try to target TDOS attacks against each other to knock each other out because they're all call centers. And so they'll try to take one call center out of business so that they get more of the call center activity. So they've themselves set up a program that only allows certain numbers to call into their toll-free numbers. And if a call comes from any other number, it rings and they answer it, but it immediately hangs up. And so we were seeing every once in a while just this spike in 1-second calls. And I thought maybe there was a quality of service issue because you would call and they would answer, you knew it was going to the right place, but then it would just disconnect you. And he said, no, that's something that they've built to keep their own customers from taking each other out of service. So, you know, that was good for me. I understand a little bit more about what he does, and, you know, that back and forth education really helps. And I also told him that that's not necessarily good because you're still, you know, causing dip charges, and, you know, other carriers out there are going to see that and continue to, you know, tell you that that's not necessarily good traffic. Internal company education, guidance and training. Of course, the more you can have as far as centralizations of policies and procedures so that everybody's on the same page, documentation and resources, and perception. Perception is key. As you saw in my quotes earlier, you can very easily get on two sides of the coin for what, you know, everybody's perception about that type of traffic is, and making sure we're all on the same page is very important. This all takes a lot of time and it can be very painful, but you know, I say here, it's all about making the time to do it. And this one's more of a quote that I like. The two most powerful warriors are patience and time. I think one thing we all know is that none of us have a magic wand that's just going to solve these problems. But, you know, always know that both sides tell a true story. There is good and there is bad when you're working with short duration traffic. The key, in my opinion, is finding that happy middle. Always remember that we're all invested in this for the same reason: the good of the industry, the good of the company, the good of the customer, and the good of the consumer. You know, you've got to always keep all of those in mind. And then, of course, working together. You know, the collaboration that we do with our, you know, with other operators in the industry, our vendors, you know, through CFCA and other associations in the industry, whatever level it's on, it benefits us all to help weed, you know, keep the good and weed out the bad. And with that, I'm done, and it can be time for questions.